What are the major technological advances that you would identify as having taken place during your career?
Well, I mean, the real major advance was from analog to digital.
Mm-hmm.
Analog, the learning curve has been like a logarithmic, but when I started, they were still cutting transcription lacquer discs, and they got the first Ampex quarter-inch tape machines, and that went for years and years and years. And then I remember Philips developed a cassette tape, and all of a sudden reporters in the field were doing everything on cassette, and they had to bring it in and transfer it to quarter-inch. And then they pushed cassette technology as far as it would go with the Dolby noise reduction and all that sort of thing, but it was still, it was still sort of an inferior technology. But then the breakthrough to digital happened, and that was like the floodgates open. I can remember still when we were quarter-inch tape and CBC were still not stereo. The only way we managed to do the early stereo recordings, because everything in those days was ruled by engineering headquarters, right? So the only way we managed to do some early stereo recordings was by using 2-track, multi-track machines. What you couldn't call them stereo, but and we had 4-track multi-tracks, and we did some 2-track multi-track mixes, sort of thing. But it took a long time for CBC to, that even admit that stereo was legit.
Well, were you broadcasting on 2 channels?
Yeah. Well, broadcasting stereo took a long time.
Yeah, right,
yeah.
right.
But we managed to do some recording, which we then had to mix down to mono, you see. But then I can remember that when CBC Toronto first signed on in FM stereo, I had the pleasure of being the first person to sign on. Studio D in Toronto, they became the new broadcast booth, and the Ward Beck mixer, so we had like one knob, but it was like stereo controls for your turntable and stuff like that, and that was a breakthrough when we went stereo.
What year?
Oh, can't remember now, but it seemed to be forever. I think it was probably towards the end of the 70s.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But then we got the breakthrough into digital when digital first started happening. And I remember...
Early 80s, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And Sony was the big prime mover and shaker there. And Sony, the rep from Sony in Toronto would bring down some equipment for us to sort of evaluate and try out. So we did the first recording we were recording Toronto Symphony at Massey Hall, Firebird, and it was going on quarter-inch tape, as usual. But we brought along this PCM 100 and a U-matic machine, and we actually ran it as a backup just for fun. And in the end, we actually convinced, at that time there was no editing facilities. Sony were still developing all this stuff. So they had a prototype. There was an AES convention in Los Angeles later that year, and Sony had the first prototype digital editor. So Anton Kwiatkowski and I flew down to Los Angeles for the AES convention, and we had 2 or 3 days in his studio out on Venice Beach with this prototype, putting together we had done an analog edit of it, so we knew what takes to use and everything. And we went and we spent 3 days putting this digital version together, and it was the first digital release for CBC, the Firebird. I mean, and in those days, you look back at it now, and it was like steam powered, because they were using videotape machines, these 3/4 inch pneumatic machines,
Yeah.
and what they did was they took the digital information and they put a sync pulse in, so it could be recorded as a video recording. So you had a sync pulse every frame, so it was, and then you played it back through this PCM 100, and it was, in the beginning, it was 14-bit. Well, it was advertised as 14-bit. I'm not quite sure they ever quite got to the 14 bits. But, so in the early days was a lot of humping around these big machines, and of course, and finally, they got an editor in Toronto, and we did a lot of editing on the DAE 3000 digital editor. And in those days, it was like assembly editing. So you had to start with, you started at the beginning of the piece, and the first take was take 3 up to letter A or something like that, and then you had to go record up to that point and stop. Then you had to go and find the next take that was going to join to it, and you played around with this really awkward system of lining up the 2, and then you had a digital preview, and then you joined those 2 together and went to the next edit point and the next edit point. And if you then had questions about an edit point or one of the takes earlier on, you basically had to go back and do it over again. It was like really, really difficult. And then after the PCM 100, which is a big bulky thing, they actually came out with the PCM 1, which started using a beta machine. So you had a beta tape recorder and a little PCM 1 unit, digital unit, and we did a lot of the early SM5000s were all done on this PCM 1. And then finally, and again, we were still dealing 14-bit, 16. They had a 16-bit, but it wasn't really recommended because the error correction wasn't as good, sort of thing. So finally, from that became the DAT machine, the DAT, which was really quite a breakthrough. And all of a sudden, the format became much smaller. The quality was much, much better. The problem was that the DAT tapes were so small that a couple of them even got lost in the early days. Then we went through this process. We did a lot of DAT recording. That was actually quite a good format. It was still fairly expensive, so Panasonic came out with the PCM, the 3500s, which was sort of a professional consumer version sort of thing. It had XLRs on it, so it was quite good. But the problem was that the transport was not as good as the Sony. It's sort of like the Beta and the VHS war all over again. Sony transports were really good, but they were quite expensive. And then the Panasonic came out with a price point that everybody jumped on, including CBC. And it was when they built the new building, CBC, and they had DAT machines in every studio. So we had like over 200 DAT machines in this building. Well, part of the way that they saved money was that the tape guides in the Panasonic was sort of like a hard plastic rather than metal. And over time, the plastic would wear. And the tolerance of DAT tapes were so critical that if it started to wear and went off, the DAT machines would stop working. It just wouldn't work up. And of course, with CBC, you had two or 300 machines that were all purchased at the same time, all had the same amount of wear on them, and they all started failing all at the same time.
Wow.
Yeah.
How many years after they would have been purchased?
4 or 5 years, maybe. Yeah, and repairing DAT machines, we tried to send them out and get serviced, and They had worked for a little while, but the tolerance was so critical on that tape. And it's funny, because some of the Sony tape machines were still working fine. But people basically, the confidence in that tapes was destroyed. So but then the technology was changing so fast. By that time, we were already starting to record on hard drives and other different formats, and now SD cards. I mean, at the time when digital was first starting, they were talking about solid state memory, and we're talking like 2 or 3 gigabytes sort of thing. That was amazing, And now it's developed to a point where you get SD cards where you can get, gigabytes, like up to 64 gigabytes, 128 gigabytes on an SD card.
Right.
Which is even smaller than a DAT tape, so it's really easy to lose.
Yeah, that's right.
But, the technology is so much, it's more robust.
Yeah. When you mentioned the advent of digital technology and you mentioned Sony, I'm sure you're aware that Sony had a certain plan in place. This would have been in the late 70s, I imagine, to introduce digital technology. And the CEO of Sony at that time was a very good friend of Herbert von Karajan. And when Karajan heard a recording, a digital recording, and it was going to be obviously issued on CD, he said, when he heard that, he says, I'm not recording anything anymore until we do it with digital, recording digital. Yeah. And so it sped up that whole transition process considerably.